Welcome. This week we're starting with color additives. This is one of three larger key submissions that we'll have. We've been looking at GROS, looking at food additives, now looking at color additives. Color additives are unique. They're fairly set. You don't see too many new color additives come on the market, but there is a process for that, and we will talk about today the general process and general definitions for color additives, and then move on next week to look at a great opportunity to see how color additive petitions work and the approval criteria there, and in particular how that compares to food additive petitions that we talked about last week. Similar petitions, similar standards, but still very different animals, so it's a great opportunity to see two different added substances treated by the FDA through a petition process. So we do this every time. We begin by asking, why are we looking at this particular part of the Food and Drug Act? Why aren't we looking at another part? Why are we even looking at the Food and Drug Act in particular? Now here it's a little bit unique. You typically see this and we say it's a food, it's a component of food, it's solely focused on the food element. And that's definitely our focus in the program, but the FDA has a much wider mandate: cosmetics, drugs, devices, a whole gamut of things that they do, even on the animal side. And the Color Additives Amendment is pretty unique in that it's an amendment to all of these provisions. It applies for cosmetics, to drugs, devices, as well as food. So we do need to be careful in looking at what we're adding it to and seeing, we'll get into listed colors, making sure our listed color is specific to food, because it does apply so broadly. We need to be specific, but it could be any of these, and so we need to look at our carefully look at our definition of what we're looking at. And so then we're looking at the Color Additive Amendment, came out in 1960, as we'll talk about. Make sure we're meeting that definition generally, and as we'll talk about what constitutes an unapproved food additive. Generally, we're talking about something that's intended to impart color, and so if that's our primary intended use, then we need to be sure that we're sensitive to the Color Additive Amendment. This process is fairly, it's definitely different than the Food Additive Amendment, where you had the different process where it was GROS or it was petition. Here we have something more nuanced. We have to be a listed color, and we're either certified, meaning we have to do batch certification, or exempt for certification. And if we're not listed, then we're doing a color additive petition. So that's generally the overview of why we're here in this amendment and what this amendment means as we go forward. I always like looking at the legislative history to see what was Congress intending, what was consumers pushing for, what was the push amongst industry by the FDA that created the current law that we have. And I think that really gives us a sense and a flavor for why we're working under the current provisions versus some other format. You know, we can look at color additive regulation in Canada, in South America, in Europe. We can look at a lot of places and compare what's unique in our culture, what's unique in our legislative history that created this system. And as you know, we start out with the 1906 Act, which is the first time that we have the Pure Food and Drug Act, and we have the Federal Meat Inspection Act, and it's the first time we have really substantive federal regulation in the food area. And the primary concern under the 1906 Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act was this poisonous and deleterious standard. We talked about it in Intro to Food Law class as the basis for adulteration. It changes under the 1938 Act. We get a bifurcated system where we talk about may render injurious and ordinarily injurious and the like. But here in the 1906 Act, the main focus on anything that was going into food, if it was there was no sense of this definition, but what we would call today something to impart color or something to impart flavor, the concern was it poisonous or deleterious? A secondary concern, in particular for the USDA, was color being used to hide a defect in meat. Was there something wrong with the product that the color would come in and attempt to hide and be very nefarious in that way? So that was a secondary concern. Something we don't see as much as we'll talk about in the 1960 amendment. Still a concern and still something that business is sensitive to, but the primary emphasis has shifted. As you saw in the reading, it's pretty unique in that the color approval process was first handed by the USDA. A little bit of history that we talked about where both acts, the Pure Food and Drug Act and the the Federal Meat Inspection Act went to the USDA, different departments within the USDA, and as those departments drifted apart, one went to the what would become the Food and Drug Administration, the other stayed in the USDA and became FSIS, FSIS. So as those drifted apart, we became a bifurcated food safety system, and so that's something that is just by happenstance. There's not really a good reason why we have two systems, two agencies that one looks at meat, they share some regulation on eggs, and then one looks at everything else. It's just something that happened. And the USDA, initially being the umbrella organization for both, did the approval process for colors, again, under this poisonous and deleterious standard, making sure that they were not something that would be harmful, but very loose standards. Eventually, as we see in the readings, that came over to the Food, Drug, and Insecticide Administration, the precursor to the FDA. So, typical story that we have for pre-amendment regulation, heavy enforcement, heavy emphasis on post-market enforcement. We're not doing a pre-market approval process for the most part. We're really relying on post-market enforcement. And typically, as is so often the case in food regulation, even today, even with the Food Safety Modernization Act, we're reactive. Someone gets sick, someone gets hurt, and then we look at the system and we say, how did this happen? And how can we make sure it doesn't happen again? And that's really what flavors so much of our current law, is a reaction to crisis. And here we saw, not only with candies, the unique thing about the orange, the little candy corns that got kids sick, is that was a known occupational hazard. It was well known that when you worked with that color chemical, that it would cause, it would be an irritant for the workers, it would cause some problems with them, but there was no ability to communicate that into the food safety system. There was no sharing of information, there was no ability that that particular evidence had to come before the FDA in making an approval determination. None of that was in place, and so even though this chemical that was used to color the candy corn was known to be an occupational hazard, it was not known until all these kids got sick in the 50s, and that spurred this part of this debate that we see in the 50s that led to so many of our adulteration amendments. But there were other incidents. The reading refers to women being blinded by eyeliner that had a particular color chemical in it, so we just have a very reactive system. And we've talked about the risks of having a heavy emphasis on post-market enforcement. Stifles innovation. You don't know if you're going to create this great new way to color your food or products, and then the FDA is going to come back later and say that it's not safe. It also completely destroys consumer confidence. You can imagine the reaction in the 1950s, candy corn pretty prevalent in the fall time and Halloween, and then having this reaction where the kids get sick, and the FDA not being able to provide a strong answer for what was in there, what was causing the illness, and how it had at least made some scientific rationale for why it could be present. So pretty damaging approach, and you can see a strong basis for why we needed something different. And the 1938 Act didn't do enough. It created this bifurcated system we talk about with two, if it's an added component versus a naturally occurring component, two different standards for adulteration. That still wasn't enough. We needed something specific to this proliferation of chemicals in food, this modernization of and industrialization of food. And so we start to get the 1960 amendment, part of a series of adulteration amendments that we've been talking about, the Food Additive Amendment, also born out of this. But before we talk about the 1960 amendment, it's important to get a few terminology, a few words that are unique to this area that if you haven't worked with color additives, you may not be as familiar with, and those are lakes, straight colors, and dilutants. And if you look at 21 CFR Part 70, you'll find a lot of the general information, including definitions for some of these terms that we're talking about. A straight color is just as it means. It's a color that's listed in Part 73, 74, and 81. 74 is the certified colors that we'll talk about. So if you see these colors, make sure again when you go into these particular sections for listed colors, there'll be subparts for each category, cosmetics, food, so on. Make sure you're looking at the right subpart for food. Straight colors, pretty easy. Lake colors, we're just talking about a combination of of straight colors or this next concept that we'll talk about, dilutants. So it's basically a combination of colors. And then the dilutants, we're talking about something that facilitates the mixture, and it's sometimes can be have a different function, and that's what the rest of the definition talks about, a sweetener or binder or something else, but it also works within the color additive mixture. So those are three terms that you'll see used a lot, and you'll see them in the regulations, you'll see them in the statute, and you'll see the FDA discussion about them as well. So it's something to clarify if you haven't worked in this area. So the 1960 amendment, through definitions, creates a very strict system of approval, and it, for the first time, provides us the definition of a color additive. And it's a two-part definition. All of our definitions, as you probably have noticed, in this class and the Intro to Food Law class are in section 201, 21 USC 201. And the further down you get in the list, the newer those definitions are. So you can see 201S is pretty far down in the list, that's a newer one. And the full definition is here, pretty bulky and big. The main takeaway, and I've used this in previous lectures, is capable of imparting color. If that's its primary intended use, then it's going to be used as a color additive. And I suppose Congress was worried that people might be cheeky and say that black or white or grays were not colors. And so the definition goes on to clarify, in case you were wondering, the black jelly bean does have actually a color additive in it that makes it that color, and the same for the white jelly bean and so on. So broad definition, but look at this concept of capable of imparting color. So that's part one of our definition. The 1960 amendment also gave us a specific definition for what constitutes an unapproved color additive, and that will be important because that sets up our statutory framework for how color additives work. And you'll notice that this numbering deviates from our previous numbering. You'll see a lot of the adulteration amendments listed as 409, 408, and so on. And they're later codified in different sections, but typically, in the 340s. But again, this amendment applies globally. It applies to cosmetics, medical devices, drugs, so on. So it's a further section down. So you'll see a little different numbering than you may have been expecting. So 379E subpart A defines unapproved color additive. And so here again, a big definition, but you see this two-part system emerge. You see in BI, batch certified, and then you see this concept of exempt from certification, and that's our primary method. So there's certified colors, non-certified colors, and then colors that need approval, and they'll fit when they're approved. They'll fit into one of those categories. But everything must be listed for color additives. If not a listed color additive, then we get into the color additive petition, which we'll talk about next week. If it is listed, it's going to be listed specifically either as a certified color, meaning it needs batch certification, it cannot be used unless that batch is certified by the FDA, or it's an exempt color. What you will notice from this definition is that there is no GROS. There is no generally recognized as safe harbor, exception, exemption, whatever you want to call it. It does not exist for color additives. That's something I want us to talk about in the discussion board today is are color additives particularly harmful in a way that food additives are not? And is that the basis for not having a generally recognized as safe exemption from the color additives amendment? And it's interesting because we talked about with the food additives amendment that it does have GROS, that was something that the FDA was familiar with in the drug industry and its regulation there, and determined that it had appropriate application in the 1958 amendment. 2 years later, we're enacting the color additives amendment, and we're not including that. And so we need to have a discussion about, well, does that make sense, especially in light of our conversation about GROS being broken? How does that fit, and is there a rationale for why it is? But regardless of that discussion, we have to be sensitive that if it's not listed, it has to be approved, and so we cannot just say it's a GROS color additive. That's just not a term that we have in this regulatory system. So here's the general overview of the process that we'll go through every time we are looking at something. And we begin by always with the definition. Is it capable of imparting color? Looking at that 201S, and also looking at that definition, that framework of unapproved food additive. And so we ask, is it listed? And we'll assume it's a listed color. We have to ask, is it a certified color? If it's a certified color, then we'll go through this process for batch certification. If it's an exempt color, then we can enter the market. We have to make sure that we're following exactly. It's almost, if you're familiar with the concept of drug monographs, they're like recipe books. You have to follow the recipe. If you deviate from the recipe, it's an adulterated, it's an unapproved color additive. So even though it's exempt, it doesn't give a free rein on how to use the color, but it gives specific restrictions on how to use that color from labeling to the like. If we get into the situation where it's not listed, it's not in any of the subparts for food, or it's not, something that we see in the listing, we cannot sell without approval. If we put an unapproved color additive into the market, you have an adulterated food product and subject to all the enforcement actions that we've talked about in the previous course. And so if you don't have a listed color, you get into the color additive petition, and again, no gloss, so there's no way to avoid the color additive petition is the emphasis I want to make. It's listed, or it's got to go through an approval process, and that's generally how our color analytical thinking goes. We just kind of keep going along this as we hit one, okay, listed, is it certified, is it exempt, and so on, and if it's not listed, we jump right to the color additive petition. So we have certified colors and we have exempt colors, and certified colors are worth having a small discussion about. Exempt colors, just look at the regulation. There's no submission there. You just comply with what's in the regulations. Certified colors are a form of submission. You do have to apply to the FDA for batch certification. All certified colors are listed in Part 74. Again, looking at the particular subpart that we have to look at, Subpart A lists certified colors for food use. And there's very specific procedures in 21 CFR Part 80, Subpart B provides all the procedures there. There's even a complete outline of what the request, the petition for color certification looks like, and you can just take that out of the regulations, paste it into Word, and start filling in the places that need to be filled in. In addition to that petition that has to be submitted, that request for a batch certification, of course, user fees, there's fees for all of these submissions, and then also a sample. And the FDA will talk to that in the guidance documents about what samples are required. And this goes to the agency to review, and they have to conduct a scientific review, chemical review of the color additive to make sure it particularly meets that listing requirement. And so we look specifically at the requirements for how it's listed. And at the end of that, it provides a batch certification. And so that certification will last for the life of the batch. And then when that batch runs out, this process starts all over again. And it's important to do the submission correctly so that you get the batch certification. And it's also important when working with food products that are colored. We gave the example of jelly beans, for example. If you're a purchaser of jelly beans, or if jelly beans come into your products, and you know that those are having a color added to them, it's important to have that discussion with the supplier to go over, okay, how are these colored? Are they colored with an exempt color, something that's naturally occurring like cochineal beetles that we see, or are they colored with something chemical that is subject to certification? If it is subject to certification, where's your certification? Where's your batch certification provided by the FDA? And not doing that is taking a risk that you're adopting their risk profile and saying potentially that you're adopting their unapproved color additive. There's also a way that you can go onto the FDA website and see who has applied for batch certification. And so if you get into a situation where you're thinking, I don't remember asking for that particular batch or that supplier's batch record, you can go on the FDA's website and gain a sense of whether or not they're actively involved in that batch certification process. Typically, firms that are engaged in that will do it pretty regularly, but it is good every time to get a certification from a supplier that is using the color additive. So again, look at all of the parts. Look at the parts for color additives that are listed. In particular, make sure you're paying attention to the certified and exempt, but also paying attention to what subpart for food or for other elements. And then here for certified colors, look at Part 74 to see if it's listed, and then look at Part 80 for the complete process, including the form letter for petition and the FDA guidance for sampling size. So that's our overview of color additives. We'll jump into the discussion board and talk about why GROS is not an element in color additive amendments, why it should or shouldn't be, and then we'll pick up next week and we will look at the comparison of food additives to color additives in the petitioning process, as well as getting into that approval criteria for color additives.